to welcome world-renowned neurologist Dr. Juan Sanchez-Ramos, and today's topic is, does heredity play a more important role than environmental factors in causing Parkinson's disease? What I'd like to also let you know is that personal diagnosis will not be discussed in these talks. You need to speak to your own physician about that. And also, please send your questions through chat. You'll have to type them in because we're muting everybody, and we thank you for that. So welcome the doctor.
There's no one as interested in the disease process than patients with PD. I have people with other movement disorders, but the population of individuals who have Parkinson's disease or similar syndrome is driven by incredible motivation to understand. So it's always fun to explain things as best as I can. So like all conditions, either health or disease, the role of the environment interacting with genetics is key. One can have inherited outstanding genes that allow for high intellectual function, for example. But if one is not in the right environment, one does not develop the intellect. If one doesn't learn to read, one doesn't learn how to reason and logic, it would be really difficult. Or even more important, that's the educational learning part. There's also the diet and environment. If one is malnourished, one can never fulfill one's full potential that is inherited with the genetic endowment. So with disease, it's the same thing. Some diseases are primarily genetic, no matter what environment you're in. Those are really strong mutations that will determine, for example, whether or not you develop Huntington's disease. It has nothing to do with the environment. If one has Huntington's disease, it's a dominant disorder. If you have that mutation, you have the illness. What happens is you can have very intensities of the illness. But that's one in which the environment isn't as important. It's mostly genetic. And there are many conditions where the environment is key. Exposures to environmental toxins, what one eats, what kinds of stresses in the environment one is susceptible to, and so forth. So we're going to focus now just on, based on the epidemiology, which is the study of the distribution of disease and the density of disease in various parts of the world, or in various cities. And we know that based on epidemiological studies around the world, and just focus right now on North America, about 1 to 2% of the population in North America that's over 65 has Parkinson's disease. So it's 1 to 2% is a pretty high prevalence of disease, and it's more likely to occur as one gets older. That's why it's more common when you're over 65. About 85% of all cases of Parkinson's disease is sporadic. In other words, we really don't know what caused it. We call it idiopathic when we don't know the cause. There's no family history. There's no environmental factors that one is aware of. That would be a sporadic case. And the majority, 85% of all the cases are sporadic. About 10 to 15% have a familial clustering. That means you'll see it in relatives, but it isn't like in every generation. So there seems to be a cluster around families. And less than 5% are due to one genetic mutation. And those tend to be clearly transmitted generation to generation. And I'll talk a bit about those. They're very rare, really, especially the one that is considered autosomal dominant, where just one of the parents has to have the mutation. And it will be transmitted. You don't need two copies of the mutated gene. That would be an autosomal dominant inheritance, the alpha-synuclein mutation. I'll talk a bit more about it because that was the first genetic mutation that made us focus on heredity much more. And the reason is that in the 19th century, actually it was thought to be hereditary. And then over time, people began to think it's got to be environmental because during the Spanish flu, quote unquote Spanish, because in Spain was the first place they were reporting this pandemic of this influenza, which killed millions and millions of people. It was the first big plague that we haven't had anything like that since this last year. and it killed a lot of people. And what's interesting is that survivors of the Spanish flu, which is a worldwide pandemic, would develop a Parkinsonism. So in the 1920s, there was a large number of patients that had survived the encephalopathy, the brain inflammation caused by the virus, and they developed Parkinson's disease. It was a little different than classical Parkinson's disease, because they also had some kind of weird eye movement, where the eyes would deviate tonically in one direction. They'd have oculogyrate crises, but they'd have slowness, rigidity, and tremor. And in those days, of course, there was no levodopa carbidopa. So there was no treatment other than the 19th century treatment of medical cannabis, preparations of belladonna alkaloids for tremors, etc. So from that point on, we thought, well, maybe all Parkinson's disease is an infection process. There's a big hunt for that. My concern is that with this new COVID-19 flu that can persist for years, and there's autoantibodies that develop, we might see the next generation of viral-induced Parkinsonism. It may be a little different, but that's what I'm very concerned about. So what's interesting, if you look at identical twins, they have the exact same DNA. They have a similar concordance for the disease as for monozygotic twins. In other words, the genetic factors can be really, really important. If they weren't important, it was more environmental, you would expect less concordance between the twins. All right, so now I'm going to talk a bit more before I continue on environmental factors, since we're on the track now. I'm going to go over the genetics, because there's been a revolution in medical genetics due to the enhanced ability to decode the genes. If you get a whole sequence, you can do whole genome sequencing, get all the letters of the chromosomes that make up the whole genome, all 32,000 genes, can be translated into their code. And because of that, one have been able to identify sequences of DNA, which are genes, in specific chromosomes that carry the gene associated with the illness. And right now there's 5 kinds of mutations that account for most of those 15% of genetic factors that cause Parkinson's disease. Not necessarily alone, but in combination with the environmental exposure. The first one is called the SNCA, the alpha-synuclein gene. The alpha-synuclein is a normal gene, and it makes a protein that's very much involved in how neurons communicate with each other. If there's a mutation in that protein, it misforms, it misfolds. Proteins have a three-dimensional structure. It misfolds and cannot be metabolized or broken down to be replaced. So over time, and this is where the aging comes in, it accumulates in those neurons, initially actually the olfactory bulb and then brainstem, but eventually in the midbrain. And when those misfolded proteins accumulate in the midbrain, they accumulate in clumps called Lewy bodies. And the Lewy body was recognized in 1913, way before we knew there was any alpha-synuclein mutations of protein in those Lewy bodies. But now we know the Lewy bodies have large amounts of clumps of the mutated alpha-synuclein. So everyone with idiopathic Parkinson's disease, that's how we diagnosed, had Lewy bodies. But not all the alpha-synuclein came from that mutation, because environmental factors can cause misfolding of proteins as well. But we know that certainly if you have a mutation in this alpha-synuclein gene, you develop Lewy bodies, and they accumulate in midbrain and cause the demise of the neurons, and that correlates with symptoms of slowness, rigidity, and tremor. And there's the second most, this is a very rare disorder. I should read a bit more about it to you. I have a little section here. It started in Italy and then in Greece. There was an Italian-Greek family in Salerno, Italy. They had 592 members of this family. 50 of them had a Parkinson's disease. So that's a big prevalence. That's, 10% of those people in this family, several generations had TB. And the researchers were able to sequence the genes of those affected, compare them to non-affected, and they identified the alpha-synuclein gene mutation. These people had an earlier age of onset than the classical Parkinson's disease. Typically, the average age was 48 years of age. It progressed really fast. The mean age of death was 56 years, so 10 years, whereas classical Parkinson's disease, when it's well managed, people live to normal expected life expectancy. So they do respond well to levodopa. And in a German family, they found a similar mutation, but a different part of that gene. And they have a cluster of people in Germany with the alpha-synuclein mutation. But the rest of the populations around the world with Parkinson's disease don't have that mutation. So it's considered to be a rare, that the mutations of alpha-synuclein are exceedingly rare cause of autosomal dominant inheritance. And this is a dominant disease. You know, every gene has a pair. So the alpha-synuclein gene has one of them came from mom, one came from dad. And so all you need is one of those pairs to be mutated and you have the disease. In the recessive disorders, you need the mutated gene from mother and from father in order to have the gene. And that leads us to the next mutation that was really well studied. It's called the Parkin mutation. And the Parkin mutation, I'm going to read this up to you a second. So PARK2 is called. The alpha-synuclein mutation is called PARK1. Now they're naming all of these mutations PARK1, PARK2, PARK3, etc. We know PARK2 is the protein, makes a protein that's mutated called the Parkin, P-A-R-K-I-N. Now Parkin is a normal chromosome. It's a normal protein that's encoded by the Parkin gene that normally helps cells break down and recycle protein. So it doesn't work properly when it's mutated, and so you end up with an accumulation of other misfolded proteins. And some of these patients, interestingly, don't have a Lewy body. So the Parkin gene mutation often doesn't have Lewy body. I'm not going to get into the mechanism. The next most common one is called the PARK7 illness, or DJ1, PARK7 gene mutation. It causes a very rare early onset PD. PINK1 is a protein that protects mitochondria. Those are the critical organelles within cells that burn fuel. And there's a defect in that gene. And so the mitochondria misfunction. That creates a lot of oxidative stress, and that also results in early onset PD. There's another one called LRK2, LRRK2. So the number of genes, I'm just going to list the most common. There's a total of maybe 18 loci have been identified. Not all of them cause inheritable disease, but they do increase the risk if you happen to inherit one of these variations amongst these 18 loci or locations in the genetic endowment. And so you can get very strong mutations, mutations that result in invariable disease, and those that will cause disease but increase the risk for it if you're in the wrong environment. So let me go on a bit further. So if the alpha-synuclein gene or the LRK2 gene is involved, Parkinson's is will be typically inherited from just one of the parents. That we call autosomal dominant pattern, where you need only one copy of the gene to be altered for the disorder to occur. PARK2, PARK7, PINK1 are autosomal recessive, and then you need two copies of the gene for the illness to be inherited. So I'm going to go now into environmental factors. So you get an idea now that we're learning more and more about the genetics, and recall that most of the cases that we have now, 10 to 15% have hereditary factors that have been identified, either risk factors or dominant or autosomal recessive inheritance. So the things that might precipitate the disease, I'm going to go over. What was really interesting, one of the first toxicants that was identified as causing the Parkinson's syndrome, not necessarily Parkinson's disease, but it looked so much like Parkinson's disease. We call it Parkinsonism, and it's related to exposure to high amounts of manganese. It was reported in Chile, in South America, and manganese miners who would mine the ore and crush it and take it out. And they developed a syndrome of psychiatric factors, slowness, rigidity, dystonia. And if they were taken out of that environment, as soon as the earliest psychiatric symptoms occurred, they often did not develop the illness, but if they would continue to work in that environment, they developed a permanent Parkinson's disease. And it does get a little better with dopamine replacement because there is a loss of dopamine neurons. But that manganese also destroys neurons that have the dopamine receptors. So levodopa, carbidopa may not be as useful in manganese induced Parkinsonism. It was also reported in the 19th century in England, around the time that James Parkinson described the shaking palsy in 1817. I'm blocking the name of the author. He wrote a report saying that manganese ore crushers in mine in England would develop this disorder that resembled Parkinson's disease. So manganese as a factor creating a Parkinson's syndrome is pretty old. We've known about it. And epidemiological studies have also pointed out that people who work in smelting with other heavy metals in various ways, welders, for example, and smelting and iron factories, they have a higher risk. It isn't that you're invariably going to get the illness from that environment, but it increases the risk of developing Parkinson's disease. Another risk factor besides your work environment with heavy metal is pesticides found in the environment. So what really pointed to this was quite fascinating was that farming and rural living are considered to be risk factors for Parkinson's disease in Western countries like Europe and North and South America. On the contrary, there's no association between farming and rural living and PD in China. So that was quite fascinating. And it has to do with the fact that in European and American farming, we use a lot more pesticides than they were using in China. In a Taiwanese study, though, rural living and farming, especially rice growing, as well as the use of herbicides and pesticides, was associated with a greater risk of PD compared to mainland China. Also, there was occasional occupational use of herbicides, pesticides, and paraquat were the two main risk factors in that Taiwanese study. Fascinating that paraquat was used for a long time. It's a pesticide that was used to kill termites and other insects that would destroy crops. It was I'm sorry, take that back. The paraquat was an herbicide to destroy crops. The pesticide I'm going to talk a bit about later. The pesticide that I have identified is called dieldrin. But other pesticides have been associated with other risks for PD. The paraquat was an herbicide used in China, but the U.S. used it a long time. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, would spray the national forests in the West, where before medical cannabis was legal, people would grow medical cannabis in national parks, in the woods, and so the DEA would spray the crops, the cannabis crop, with paraquat, and that probably in that population of hippies that were growing cannabis probably have a higher risk of developing Parkinson's disease. But we'll wait and see. Another interesting toxicant that created a big a cluster of Parkinson's syndrome was in San Francisco in 1983. There was about a cluster of 400 patients who had developed Parkinsonism rather quickly, acutely, subacutely, and they were all IV drug abusers. And Dr. Langston, who was at Stanford at the time, was able to ascertain that they were using a street drug, a designer drug, that was considered synthetic heroin from China. That's what they called it, China White. And really it was made in an underground lab, and this chemistry student's lab in the basement. And he was basically making a synthetic morphine called meperidine, known as Demerol, and selling it as heroin. But the fact is he was a very good chemist, and he contaminated the pyridine synthesis with a contaminant called MPTP. And that was identified eventually by Dr. Langston getting a sample of the drug that people were shooting up and identified MPTP. And the way he could prove that it was causing Parkinson's disease or Parkinson's syndrome, he injected it into rats and then into monkeys, and it reproduced the Parkinson's syndrome in these animals because it would destroy dopamine neurons. So this is an example of an underground chemical that contaminated synthetic Demerol production. It was actually, when that was happening, I was a resident in neurology, and I had done a lot of work with opioid pharmacology and the endogenous opioid system. So I was fascinated by how MPTP, which has a contaminant of the Demerol, synthetic opiate, was able to zoom in and recognize dopamine neurons. So I decided I would look for environmental factors like MPTP that might cause Parkinson's disease. So that's how I ended up going to the University of Miami and doing research with Dr. Bill Weiner and Dr. Franz Hefty. And we screened over 100 environmental toxicants that had structures that were similar to the MPTP. I also ended up screening pesticides while I was at it. And there we found that the one pesticide that could destroy dopamine neurons was called Dieldrin, which was banned since 1960 something, because just along with DDT was also banned because of the hazard to birds and other life forms and to humans. And so Dieldrin is no longer used. What's fascinating is that Dieldrin stays in body fat forever, and you can still measure Dieldrin in living patients, even though they might have been occupied, and also DDT metabolized. It's still in the fat, which hardly gets broken down. And so these lipid-soluble chemicals are I identified as being perhaps an environmental risk factor for Parkinson's disease. Now, continue the comparison between Taiwan and mainland China, that really in mainland China, they really use very little pesticides and herbicides, at least in the past. And that's why they had a lower prevalence. But they've become very modernized and have taken the same agricultural practices as the West. So they're getting an increased frequency of Parkinson's disease related to environmental factors. Dietary influences are very important. That's one of the major environmental factors. We eat what's around us. Our foods come from the environment. And so when we take milk, for example, well, whatever that cow is eating is going to get into the milk or into the muscle or the meat that we eat. And they tend to concentrate it. Same with fish. They'll tend to concentrate heavy metals. So mercury in fish and Everglades is extremely high. But getting down to dietary intake, it's really difficult to accurately record different population diets. We talk about the Mediterranean diet versus the Northern and Western European diet, which is rich in animal fats. They're very different. But we've noted that the consumption of vitamin E has been studied and reported to be a lot lower in PD patients. So looking at PD patients and doing an analysis of how much vitamin E they've taken for the previous 10, 20, 30 years shows that it's lower than people who don't have PD. And then there was some experimental evidence that individuals that have a vitamin E deficiency, they tend to have reduced fluorodopa uptake in PET scans. In other words, that vitamin E deficiency can result in some problems with the dopaminergic system. However, other studies have shown that vitamin E consumption through diet or supplement doesn't provide significant protective effects. That was one of the first clinical studies I was involved in at the University of Miami, was the effects of high-dose vitamin E plus or minus coenzyme Q10 in early PD to see if it would slow progression, and we were disappointed to find out it didn't slow progression. But if you're vitamin E deficient, you might have a higher risk. So make sure you get vitamin E in your multivitamin. beverages. So what's fascinating comparing China to the Western world, consumption of tea amongst the Chinese, as well as coffee drinking among Caucasians in Western Europe and North America, has been protective against PD. They find if you're a coffee drinker or a tea drinker in both of these populations, they tend to decrease the likelihood of developing Parkinson's disease. So tea drinking has been reported as a protective factor for Parkinson's in the Hong Kong Chinese study. That was a very well done study. Consumption of herbal tea and fruits from a family that contains neurotoxic alkaloids has been associated with a typical Parkinsonism. So some of the teas and fruits might actually be toxic. So there's I'm thinking of the common name. In Jamaica, very popular herbal tea and fruit. They tend to develop what looks like progressive supranuclear palsy, which is an atypical Parkinson's syndrome, in which voluntary eye movement becomes difficult, and then one can't gaze right, left, up, and down without moving the head up, down, like that. Now, there is some of the teas, if you get these teas and fruits from the Annonnaceae family. I don't even know how to translate that into a common. I'll think of it before this is over. It's a popular tea that people, especially if it's made from the leaves. What's interesting though is that I'm blocked. Yeah, that there's a protective effect of tea. What's it do to? I mean, we saw that drinkers of tea and coffee tend to have less, especially green tea, have a protective effect. There's some very potent antioxidant properties of these teas. Tea and coffee contain similar protective micronutrients such as caffeine or theophylline. They seem to be somewhat neuroprotective. And how caffeine works by inhibiting a certain enzyme, there are new class of drugs that are being developed, being studied that work in the same way as caffeine to treat Parkinson's and maybe slow progression. So if you drink a lot of coffee most of your life, you're less likely to develop Parkinson's disease. Let me continue. Smoking cigarettes, which is interesting. We know it's very unhealthy. That's why there was a big public relations effort supported by plenty of scientific data that it could increase the risk for lung cancer. And there's been a big effort to decrease smoking, and it has decreased in general, though smoking tended to be increased in younger people and women. In any case, the protective effect of smoking has been reported. In other words, cigarette smokers, if they live long enough, right, the ones that didn't develop lung cancer, would have less likelihood of developing Parkinson's disease. And it's, of course, the possibility is that people who smoke have greater mortality than those who don't, and so don't get to the age at which PD becomes evident. So you'll see that less, more people with Parkinson's disease were never smokers, were not smokers. Those that smoke have died, and so you don't see as much PD. But given that there's a consistent inverse relationship between smoking and no PD or PD and no smoking, there seems to be support for nicotine being protected. The nicotine, which is the addictive component that leads to addiction in the smoking of cigarettes, and what gives the psychoactive boost to cigarette smoking, is protective against dopamine neuron loss in an animal model of Parkinson's disease produced by that toxin I alluded to, MPTP. So there is some evidence that nicotine may be the reason that there's a protective effect of cigarette smoking in Parkinson's disease. So people, like tell people, they say, well, should I just take nicotine patch like smokers who want, like people who want to stop smoking? What's fascinating is that nicotinic drugs are being studied for Alzheimer's disease to try to enhance cognition. And there's no real good studies of nicotine in Parkinson's disease early on, or to try to slow progression. So nicotine you become dependent on it. It causes addiction if you use it on a regular basis. And don't know what the negative effects would be in a Parkinson's patient. So it's a theoretical idea that nicotine may slow progression of the disease. So heavy metals, pesticides, herbicides, specific chemicals that can accumulate in the brain can increase the risk. And there are some chemicals in the environment, in the diet, that might protect against PD. So what about the interaction of gene and environment? Well, studies in Western Europe among the Caucasians have shown that genetic polymorphism of MAO-B, that means a slight variation in the gene that makes monoamine oxidase B. MAO-B is the enzyme that breaks down dopamine. And by inhibiting MAO-B, that's what selegiline does, or azelaic does, you decrease oxidative stress, which is believed to slow progression of disease. That's why we began using azelaic or selegiline at the early stages of the illness to try to slow progression. So the polymorphisms in this enzyme, MAO-B, will modify the association of smoking and TB, and that it might increase the risk of associating with TB in one genotype, but might reduce it in another. So that's an example of an interaction where smoking may be protective in some people for nicotine, but if you have a polymorphism in MAO-B, it may not be protective. So similarly, there's something called glutathione transferase polymorphism. They can interact with pesticides and increasing the risk of PD. So some of these genetic risk factors actually amplify the risk of the pesticide being toxic. One of the interesting things that Chan et al. From China found that the protective effect of tea drinking masks the increased risk of MAO-B polymorphism. So the tea, even though there's increased risk of PD due to monoamine oxidase polymorphisms in PD, by having tea, it decreased that risk. Let me see what else. And that's all I'm going to talk about now, just to say that, in a nutshell, that hereditary PD is associated with genetic defects of these. Well, there's 5 or 6 most common mutations that are associated with TD, hereditary PD. If not directly causing TD, at least increasing the risk for it. And of course, there are neurotoxicants, herbicides, pesticides, and heavy metals that can cause neuronal damage and lead to TD. And there's some genetic susceptibilities, which I didn't talk much about, is that the ability to metabolize chemicals from our environment is handled by what we call CY, cytochrome P450. It's a family of products made of enzymes that are responsible for breaking down xenobiotics or chemicals from the environment. And some of these mutations or variations in the cytochrome P450 genes result in poor metabolism of what we call xenobiotics or neurotoxins. So that's another risk factor that I didn't mention in terms of increasing the risk. So what I think is people exposed to, say, in rural areas that grew up drinking well water, they have a higher risk of TB. But not everyone who grew up drinking well water develops Parkinson's disease, but probably those that have the susceptibility to that environmental toxin in the well water due to poor ability to break down or metabolize that foreign chemical. So I think I'll be glad to see what questions you have and try to answer them for you.
I'll ask a question, Doctor. You talk about heredity. Are there things that people can do to slow down the progression of Parkinson's, the symptoms of Parkinson's by lifestyle. So things that they might do, even though their parent may have had it at 60 or 70, is there something that they can do that may help them? What would you suggest?
Well, not necessarily the symptoms so much as the rate of progression of the illness can be slowed by aerobic exercise. It's one of the ones that is known to work the best. The reason being is that as you increase blood flow to the brain, it stimulates your astrocytes to produce more growth factors. These are like fertilizers for neurons, and two of them, BDNF and GDNF, are fertilizers for dopamine neurons, so it allows them to survive longer. So we know that in animal studies that's true. And in animal studies, we know that the aerobic exercises enhances the birth of new neurons in the hippocampus, so it stabilizes cognitive decline as well. So aerobic exercise, by that I mean getting on a treadmill, a cycle, running, jogging, walking fast, and getting your heart rate to 80% of max for your age. So if you're 70, you should try to get to about 120 beats per minute for at least 5 minutes of a half hour of time, and you work towards that. And if you do that at least 3 times a week on a half hour aerobic exercise program. The second thing that will alleviate symptoms, not necessarily slow progression. And that's what was the question you're asking, how can we alleviate symptoms that get worse with time? Well, one is to stop the progression of the underlying pathology, aerobic exercises, plenty of well-balanced meals with plenty of antioxidants, fruits, vegetables. But the improvement of rigidity and balance can be achieved with regular yoga exercise. One of the best for stretching and loosening increased muscle tone. If you get into a regular daily yoga practice, and if you have terrible balance, you do chair yoga. And so so the combination of aerobic exercise followed by a yoga session. If you did that every day, you do really well for a long time.
Perfect. Thank you. Sherry would like to know if stress can increase the risk and bring Parkinson's disease on faster.
Stress. Yes, all stresses, be it psychological or physiological, will amplify symptoms of the illness. It won't necessarily bring on increase the pathogenesis of it and bring it on earlier, but it certainly allows the symptoms perhaps to become evident a little bit earlier. There are many lawsuits. I remember Dr. Weiner was involved in some where people were involved in an automobile accident. They claimed they had no symptoms of Parkinson's disease, so they were the right age for developing it. They were 60, let's say. And they would develop about a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks after tremor and Parkinsonism. And they'd come in and Dr. Weiner would examine and say, yeah, you do have the beginnings of Parkinson's disease. And they'd say, well, do you think this auto accident caused it? Well, the person did not get a head bump or did not lose consciousness. And so we did a review of trauma and Parkinson's disease. And the only way that head trauma will cause Parkinsonism, and you can say that the trauma caused the Parkinson's disease, is to have changes in the MRI within a day or two after the accident. And also there has to be some kind of head injury with loss of consciousness. So I forget what was your question? I got on a tangent about trauma and Parkinson's, another cause for
We
Parkinson's.
were talking about stress, slowing it down, but you answered.
Stress. Okay, that's an example of a physical stress that can actually cause the illness because of brain injury. But there are psychological and physiological stress that will amplify the symptoms. So the most common physiological stress where people over 2 or 3 days suddenly are really worse. They haven't changed their dose. They have a hard time getting up from their chair. They're sometimes confused. And it's usually a urinary tract infection. It's a silent urinary tract infection that creates a physiological stress that amplifies your symptoms. It isn't that it's increasing the progression of the disease. You treat the UTI and you get back to baseline. Similarly, you have surgery for your hip or the knee replacement. Well, you're going to be down for a while. The stress of that surgery recovery is going to amplify your symptoms. And it'll take 3 to 4 months before you come back to pre-surgical baseline. Pathogenesis is what's happening within your brain at the cellular or molecular level
Mhm.
Symptoms are the final expression of the illness and how something that we can see and detect and feel the rigidity. And the symptoms are a reflection of pathology, but the symptoms can be amplified by stress, psychological stress,
All right.
without amplifying the pathology.
Okay, we have another question, and you already touched on this, so I think you can answer this one pretty quickly. Do you recommend having coffee?
Coffee,
Again, yeah.
I recommend it in the morning without milk because milk will slow down the transport of levodopa. But the coffee has several benefits. It will increase focus and attention. It will also work well with levodopa. It potentiates levodopa action, like the drugs that I've described that are similar to caffeine. So yeah, and the third benefit, which is many patients like, it's great for the bowel movement, especially if you make fresh ground coffee, you pour over, don't get, canned coffee that has hardly anything in it. It tastes terrible. Starbucks coffee is very good, but you can make your own excellent coffee and you'll have better bowel movements. And constipation is one of the features of Parkinson's disease, autonomic nervous. So definitely drink coffee. If I don't get PD, it's probably because I'm a heavy coffee drinker. But I'll get some other disease for sure, like cardiac disease. So you choose the diseases by what environments you immerse yourself in.
Have you seen any studies on mannitol? Not sure if this pertains to our talk today, so if we can, do you want me to move on from there?
There's no studies on mannitol. Mannitol we use if there's brain swelling. It decreases edema in the brain. It's good laxative too. There's a mannitol-based osmotic laxative. You drink it. But no, there's nothing about mannitol for Parkinson's disease. And it might have some antioxidative effects as well, but it's not something that I recommend.
All right. We want to thank you, Dr. Sanchez-Ramos, for coming today and for giving us all this great information. Put your hands together for the doctor. And it was a wonderful talk. And we look forward to seeing you next month.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Well, wear your mask when you go out.